Hello and welcome to the FDA regulations class within the College of Public Health at UAMS. The purpose of this video is twofold. One is to introduce myself as the instructor, and the other is to give you a little bit of the background information that you need for the class, hopefully save you a little bit of reading in this first week. I know that reading is a little bit daunting. My name is Mitch McGill. As I said, I'm the primary instructor in the course. I earned my PhD in toxicology at the University of Kansas School of Medicine. I then did a postdoctoral fellowship at Washington University in St. Louis, and I've been an assistant professor in public health for the last 40 years or so. The focus of my research is drug-induced liver injury, but in addition to my work at UAMS, I also consult for both pharmaceutical companies and in vitro diagnostic IVD test developers, biotech companies, that sort of thing, regarding regulatory affairs. So I have a little bit of background in this area, at least. As far as the sort of getting you started in the class, I want to cover today FDA history, FDA structure, and then just to touch on FDA function, okay? So let's start with the history. I think FDA history is actually super fascinating. It's one of the oldest regulatory agencies in the U.S. It was founded in 1839, and it actually started as the agricultural division within the U.S. Patent Office. And that may seem really weird. Why is the FDA starting in the Patent Office? But actually in the early 1800s, poor farming practices were really widespread. You know, farmers weren't rotating crops. They were using poor seed cultivars, poor quality seeds, and they weren't really staying up to date with the latest tools and technology to increase productivity. And so these patent officers who are seeing patent applications for new seeds, new technologies for farming coming across their desks, they decided, okay, we need to disseminate this to U.S. farmers so we can increase agricultural productivity. That turned out to be pretty effective and very popular. And so in 1862, President Lincoln actually established the USDA, moving the agricultural division out from under the U.S. Patent Office. And then within the USDA, they also established the Division of Chemistry, which would later become the Bureau of Chemistry, and then eventually the FDA. The early 20th century brought many changes to the Bureau of Chemistry or Division of Chemistry. So the primary job of the division in the 19th century and the 1800s was to provide scientific advice to other government agencies in addition to distributing seeds and that sort of thing. However, with the growth in patent medicines and quackery that frequently involved mislabeled or adulterated or misidentified drugs, combined with growing awareness of unsanitary practices in the food industry with publication of books like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, along with the sort of popularization of decades of research done by the food safety pioneer Harvey Wiley, who had been showing widespread adulteration of food products, voters kind of started to demand better regulation of the food and drug industries, okay? So in 1906, we got the Pure Food and Drug Act, which made it illegal to transport and sell adulterated or mislabeled drugs across state lines. And it also gave the Bureau of Chemistry, which is what it was called at that time, law enforcement powers. And that law actually passed thanks in large part to the advocacy of Harvey Wiley himself, who had been appointed the 7th director of the Bureau of Chemistry. And he's now widely considered, because of all this, the first real FDA commissioner, even though it wasn't really called the FDA yet. Just as an aside, Harvey Wiley's a really interesting figure. He was a giant in food safety, and he's really famous for his controversial Poison Squad, which was a group of young men that basically would taste chemicals or eat small amounts of chemicals over some period of time to determine the toxic effects. So there's a pretty good PBS documentary about Harvey Wiley and the Poison Squad. It used to be free online. You can probably still find it somewhere. And there's also a good episode of the podcast, Stuff You Should Know, about the Poison Squad. But even though it was great that we had this 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, over the next decade or two it became pretty clear that it had major limitations. It just wasn't enough. So, for example, the Act said that a product was misbranded if the packaging bore, quote, any statement false or misleading, okay? Which sounds pretty clear to us, but the Supreme Court in 1911, in the case U.S. versus Johnson, actually ruled that this language only applied to the content of the bottle itself and not what the content could do, okay? So in other words, as long as the label was accurate with regard to what was inside the bottle, it didn't matter if the label also had hyped up claims about what that drug could actually do. So that made a lot of people worried that there were false and misleading statements, or people were wasting their money on drugs that weren't going to help cure their diseases. In addition, the Act didn't cover cosmetics or medical devices, so a lot of people in the Bureau of Chemistry were worried about that as well. As a result, in 1933, the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, Rex Tugwell, assembled a team of experts to work on a new drug, or a new act, basically an updated version of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. They hit some snags. It kind of stayed in legislative limbo for a while because representatives and senators were fighting over who should control advertising of these products, these food and drug products. Should it be the FDA, or should it be the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC? Now, that issue was finally resolved in early 1938 with the passage of the Wheeler-Lee Amendment to the Federal Trade Commission Act, which gave the FTC the power to regulate advertising claims. And it's more or less still that way today, with a little bit of nuance. So today, the FDA regulates labels as well as advertising related to prescription drugs. The FTC regulates advertising related to over-the-counter products and other similar things. At the same time, around 1937, 1938, we had the elixir sulfanilamide tragedy here. So from around 1910, when it was discovered and marketed, to 1938, the antibiotic sulfanilamide was only available in a tablet form, so you just swallow it, right? But there was increasing demand in the U.S. for a liquid form of the drug. I guess people didn't like the taste or the size of the pill, something like that. And supposedly, there was demand specifically in the South for a sweet liquid form of the drug because, Southerners like their sweet tea or something. I don't know if that detail is actually true, but you'll find it if you Google this stuff. It's going to come up. In any case, to satisfy this demand, and particularly demand for a sweet form, the chief chemist at Massengill, which made sulfanilamide, his name was Harold Watkins, he created a new formulation of it where he basically just ground up sulfanilamide, mixed it with some raspberry flavoring, and dissolved the whole thing in a solution of 70% diethylene glycol, or DEG. Now, if ethylene glycol sounds familiar, that's because it's antifreeze, or radiator fluid. And many of us are aware of the fact that antifreeze is very nephrotoxic. It causes severe acute kidney injury. So, unfortunately, after this product hit the market, about 100 people died, and many more became sick due to the nephrotoxic effects of the DEG. A lot of pressure came down on the company. The chemist Watkins himself actually committed suicide, although his wife claims it was an accident while he was cleaning his gun. But what's really fascinating is that when questioned about the culpability of the Massengill company in these deaths, the owner very infamously said, "There's no way we, quote, could have foreseen unlooked-for results." There's no way we could have foreseen unlooked-for results. What he meant was the FDA at the time did not require safety testing. So if you're not requiring us to test the safety, how could we know it's not safe, right? This led to the addition, kind of at the last minute, of a new section to the updated Food and Drug Law that required safety testing during development of a new drug, which is kind of how we know things operate today. So with the resolution of that FDA-FTC power struggle, and with the extra motivation provided by the sulfanilamide tragedy, the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or FDCA, was passed. And that essentially created the modern FDA that we know today. There have been amendments, there have been to the FDCA, and there have been additional laws passed. And your book touches on that a little bit, so you can skim those sections. But these are the critical things to know, okay? You have the the FDA starting under the USDA, essentially. You have the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, but it wasn't strong enough, so now we have the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, or FDCA. And that's really what gave birth to the modern FDA. So that's the history. Let's talk a little bit about FDA structure. So today, the FDA is housed within the Department of Health and Human Services, or DHHS. And in fact, some FDA officials are actually U.S. Public Health Service officers. So if you regularly attend scientific conferences, you'll sometimes see them walking around in what look like military uniforms, right? Now, at the head of the FDA is the Office of the Commissioner, headquartered in Washington, D.C. The current acting FDA Commissioner is Janet Woodcock. And then there are about a dozen headquarters offices, like the Office of the Chief Counsel, Office of Regulatory Affairs, and so on, that are sort of located around the nucleus of the Office of the Commissioner. And then you also have 7 scientific centers, okay? And those centers are what we're mainly going to focus on in this class, because those 7 centers are responsible for all scientific and advisory responsibilities of the FDA. Whereas those offices, the dozen or so offices that I mentioned, they deal with policy, public outreach, that kind of thing, law enforcement, that sort of thing. So those 7 centers, I'm going to tell you what they're called and then tell you just a quick summary of what they do. This is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER or CDER, and they're responsible for evaluation or regulation of drugs, small molecule drugs, as well as biologics, so recombinant proteins, monoclonal antibodies, that sort of thing, so drugs and biologics. Then you have the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, CBER. And it's a little bit confusing because they don't regulate biologics. CDER does that. But what they do regulate is biological products, so vaccines, gene therapies, blood products, that kind of thing. Then there's the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH. They regulate medical devices as well as any radiation-emitting medical product. Then you have the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, CFSAN, or CFSAN. And CFSAN regulates food, but also dietary supplements, cosmetics, and some other things. Then there's the Center for Veterinary Medicine, or CVM. Of course, they regulate drugs and medical products for animals. And then you have these 2 kind of unique centers that they don't really do product evaluation and regulation in the way that the other centers do. Instead, they're more about implementing policy, okay? So first you have the Center for Tobacco Products, or CTP, and they oversee implementation of regulations and recommendations contained within the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, okay? And then there's the Oncology Center for Excellence, and what they do, this is the newest center, it's only been around for just within the last few years. What they do is oversee efforts to expedite development and approval of chemotherapeutics to treat cancer, okay? In addition to those 7 centers that we're going to focus on, 2 of the headquarters offices deserve some special attention for this class. And those are the Office of Regulatory Affairs, or ORA, and the Office of the Chief Scientist, okay? So the ORA is responsible for law enforcement activities, and they operate, basically they are the ones who operate 20 different field offices and over 100 inspection stations around the country. And those folks perform inspections, and they enforce regulations, and then they communicate with the Office of the Commissioner, because they're often the people on the ground who are the first to notice patterns of toxic outbreaks or foodborne illnesses, that sort of thing. And then the Office of the Chief Scientist is notable for us because within the Office of the Chief Scientist is the National Center for Toxicological Research, or NCTR. And that's the major research arm of the FDA. Okay, there are other places that do some scientific evaluation of products and that sort of thing within the FDA, but NCTR is the major bench research arm. And they're located just about 45 minutes south of UAMS down in Jefferson, Arkansas. Now, so that's a little bit about the structure of the FDA. I'm just going to touch briefly on function now. So the FDA has several means, basically four major ways that they can implement and distribute policy. Okay, probably the most powerful is referred to as rulemaking. So that's number one, and that's basically what it sounds like. It's the issuing of rules and regulations that are enforceable in courts. Okay, we have a history of those rules being enforced in courts, so they do carry the weight of law. The second is creation of industry guidance documents. Now, guidance documents do not establish legally enforceable rules. Rather, they provide the agency's interpretation of how existing rules apply in specific circumstances. Okay? So, for example, there's a guidance document that I reference quite a bit about validation of in vitro diagnostic or IVD tests. Okay? And what that gives you is that it gives you the agency's idea of how those IVD tests should be validated. But speaking from my own experience, not every recommendation in that document can apply to every IVD test. Okay, different tests are different, have different properties, different chemistry, and so on, and need to be validated somewhat differently. So you have to use the document as a guide instead to sort of see what is it that the FDA considers the most important steps in a validation. So you can say, okay, they want this, this, and this. How can I get those data for my product specifically, okay, in a way that's appropriate for my product? Okay, so guidance documents. And three, you have meetings and hearings. These are actually two different things, but both give the FDA opportunities to hear opinions regarding specific products or policies from stakeholders like industry workers, members of the public, academics, and so on. And it gives them an opportunity to share their views at the present on different products and policies. And then finally, number four, there are public statements, okay? And these are just come in many different forms, but the FDA can issue public health alerts, health advisories, product recall notifications, and so on. But they all inform the public of potential dangers, and they can encourage action by private companies. Obviously, if there's a recall notice, the company needs to do something. If there are public health alerts regarding a product, the companies might want to take action to avoid bad publicity or that sort of thing. Okay, so I think with that background, you're well equipped to start the course. We pretty much covered the high points of the chapters on history and structure of the FDA. You may want to skim a little bit particularly the sections on how the FDA interacts with other agencies as well as with Congress, because we didn't really cover that, but just skim it, and then you can kind of focus on the chapter on philosophy of food and drug law. So, all right, good luck with the class. I'm glad to have you guys in it, and take care.